Welcome back to the American Tradition. My name is Jeremy Mack, pastor, farmer, localist, essayist. All right, we're continuing in our series on instability and American instability. And today we're going to be dealing with economic instability. If you remember from our last video, we talked about how there was a moral instability that had developed in the United States beginning in the 1930s once the major mainline Protestant denominations had fallen. And that sort of was the signal that secularism or a new secular religion had taken over, and that secular religion had dogmas. And those dogmas were atheism on the one hand, materialism on the other. Materialism being there's nothing in the future, everything's about the here and now, and the satiation or the satisfying of our desires. And then because of the Industrial Revolution, we also had a consumerization where every tool and toy could possibly be made to increase man's desires and to satiate almost any desire he could come up with. So we have now a society where what I would say is our passions and desires are running amok. All right. So we're seeing that personally, we're seeing that familially, and we're also seeing that nationally because individuals and families are what make up generally a nation. So it is our out of control passions. So I used about 100-year time frame or so as from the last time, going from 1930 to 2020. So it brings us up around 90 years. Today I'm going to use about a 60-year time frame because that's going to be in general, that's going to be in the historical memory of most people. So if we think about economic instability, so a lot of people would go back, say, to the 1970s. I would say, when Nixon closes the gold window in 1971. So before the U.S. in 1971 was on what's called a fractional reserve system, there had to be a certain amount of gold held in trust in the Federal Reserve for every dollar that was printed. And so there was a fractional reserve. So that means there was a fraction of gold for the total for the amount of dollars. So and that had to be a fraction of a set amount. And in 1971, because of the development of a warfare state, so after World War II, in Bretton Woods Conference, the U.S. becomes the world reserve currency, and we agree that we will take on the lion's share of the defense of the NATO nations. So the NATO nations, then we're going to pay like 4% of their GDP. You might remember that President Donald Trump was trying to get the Europeans to pay their fair share of NATO dues. So that was developed back around the period of the Bretton Woods Conference and when we became the world reserve currency. And so we developed what's called the warfare state, or what some call the warfare state. And America began to build bases around the world, and we began to be sort of the world's policeman and the defender of Europe, the defender of their NATO allies. And so we had strategically positioned bases all over Europe. And usually that was sort of, those bases were put in place because of our relationship or lack of relationship with the Soviets at that time. And so the warfare state begins to rise up. It has an intelligence apparatus. It has military expansion. So after the Bretton Woods Conference, we have not only the reserve currency in the world, but we have a massive warfare state that begins to be developed. And then around the 1960s, because there was a ton of course, racial injustice in the U.S., and there were some of the major cities that had come about after the Industrial Revolution were starting to fall into disrepair. And so Lyndon Baines Johnson began what's called the War on Poverty. And the War on Poverty began really a huge expansion on the welfare state. The welfare state really begins under FDR in the New Deal, but it finds its stride in the 1960s. And so you have the warfare state and the welfare state. And the warfare state and the welfare state combined to cause America's overall expenses to rise astronomically. And that's what causes Nixon to have to close the gold window in 1971, because the appetite for new spending in the federal government outstrips its ability to purchase and hold gold. And so they cut it free from gold in 1971. That's what we mean by closing the gold window, and America becomes pretty much a fiat currency. Well, not pretty much a fiat currency. It becomes a fiat currency. It's just paper. It's only worth what you believe that it's worth. So this leads to a lot of what we'll call rolling in the market. So that's 1971. You have stagflation in the 1970s. We have an oil crisis in the 1970s. You have which gives rise to Ronald Reagan and Reagan sort of revolution of the 1980s and the Reagan revolution of the 1980s. The mantra of the Republicans begins to be deficits don't matter. So they're spending, especially on the warfare state, so that they can defeat the Soviets. So they're trying to drive the Soviets over a fiscal cliff. They succeed in that by 1988, 89. The Soviets really are falling apart and the wall comes down. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. So there's some good developments from that. But what happens is we really start piling on the debt. And what we have to understand about the debt is that the debt's really begins to be developed, both personal debt, corporate debt, state debt, and then federal debt begins to really pile up. But it begins to pile up really when we shift out of a Christian civilization and a Christian understanding of the world we'll say 1930, but it really is disintegrating before that. But we'll say in 1930, and we'll call that's when modernity or the modern world comes into existence. So we leave officially sort of a Christian understanding of the world around 1930, and we become materialists, as I said, and we begin to satiate these desires. And so our debt and the piling up of debt really has to do with our out of control passions and our out of control desires. We become confused over what is necessary and what is additional or what's luxury. And so we begin to have serious economic problems, and this debt begins to build up. And so then we start to have economic problems based on that debt, because we don't have a lot of savings floating around in the society at large. Excuse me. So one of the things that in the past, when we were a Christian civilization, was we were a society that was based on savings, not based on debt. So we believed that savings came from investment, and so we encouraged savings. So one of the things that the U.S. always did before the massive change of the 1930s is we encourage savings. So how do we encourage savings? Well, we paid a high interest rate, because a high interest rate discourages people from borrowing and encourages people from saving. And then the fractional reserve system. So originally we were on a full gold system, and then we became a fractional gold system. I think that's 1933, actually, from a fractional gold system, and then we moved to a fiat system. But originally, what we had was a strong currency that held its value, and then we encouraged people to hold on to that currency and save that currency. And then when they wanted to build a house, or they wanted to build a bridge in their community, or they wanted to do things, then everybody participated in the investment from their savings. Okay, now if you fast forward to the 1970s, we've closed the gold window, and everything we do infrastructure wise is based on debt and borrowing and bond sales and things like that. And so now we're a society no longer based on savings and no longer based on savings and investment, no longer based on a strong currency. We become a society that's based on a super weak currency with a goal of actually weakening it all the time. And then we begin to encourage spending as a way. This is Lord Keynes, Keynesian economist. This is his impact on the West coming through after World War II, because Lord Keynes said, why save? In the end, we're all dead. That was his, in the end, we all die. And we don't want all that liquidity trapped in the banks. We want it out there flowing and creating and doing things. So everybody was to be spending. So that totally changed the way that we thought about interest rates. So we started lowering interest rates down to these, what we have now, historic, like 5,000-year lows in interest rates. I didn't say 5-year lows. I didn't say 500-year lows. I didn't say 50-year lows. I said 5,000-year lows. So these 5,000-year historical low interest rates start causing the American people, well, not cause is not a good word to use there, that encourage what's called malinvestment. So when your appetites are out of control and you no longer realize what is needed versus what is a luxury, and you start borrowing for luxury and building lives based on luxury, the debt capacity really, really, really starts to increase during that period. And that's what brings us to our economic instability. So if I think about 1987, it was Black Monday. My parents went to work that morning. They came home at lunchtime or maybe 2 in the afternoon. It was early that day, and they were really down in the mouth. And I said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "We don't have jobs." They both worked at the same company, and the stock on their company was the collateral for the loan for the company, for the business loan that started the company. And when the 87 happened and the stock price dumped off, the bank called their loan that day and took over control of all the business's assets and all the employees' home. And that business was no more. It was bankrupt. It was gone. So 87 happens, and 91 we have a savings and loan crisis. Notice that's related to banking. Okay, the banks have a savings and loan crisis, right? The ratios are really out, and we've got a crisis. We've got to bail out the banks. So then 99 and 2000, you have tech stocks are through the ceiling, and everybody is investing in tech stocks. And overnight, I knew guys who were millionaires, and one day and the next day they were working 2 jobs trying to keep their house payments up. In 2007, we have a big, huge real estate collapse. Again, it's financials and it's related to banking. So, and what happens is because the banks no longer have to. So banking used to be one of the most, people who banked or who were bankers were like really tight guys. They had their behinds always puckered up, and the reason was, it's a funny way of thinking about it. The reason was, it's because they watched actuarial charts and they, wanted to make sure you have collateral for everything. I think it's the new Fantastic Beast movie, the sort of Harry Potter spinoff where the guy wants to make a bakery, right? And he asks, "What, give me your collateral, give me your collateral." And he doesn't have any collateral, so he leaves and he doesn't get his loan. It's not the way banks generally work now, collateral wise. So when you think about banking used to be this really foundational thing that everything was invested safely. And so the way the banks made their money was, let's say you bought a house and they gave you an 8% interest rate loan. And you might say, 8%, golly, that's really high. Well, my parents borrowed, I think, at 10 or 11% back in 1970. And they put 20% down on a house too. And they were only 23 or 24 years old when they did that. So could you put 20% down on your house? Could you carry a 10% interest rate? No, you could not. So one of the things that I would point to about the weakness of our economy is the way we've had to restructure loans where you almost put nothing down. And we've had to restructure loans where interest rates are so low because the American public is so fragile, they can no longer carry a proper interest rate. But I digress. So the way that you used to do that was you paid an 8% interest loan, and then the bank paid like a 5% interest to like grandmothers when they invested in savings accounts, and then used the money in the savings account to make the loans on the houses, and then they made the 3% between. That was the 3%. It's what they ran on and what they profited on. And so they wanted to guarantee that 3%, and the banks would go under. And so that's how they worked, and that's why they were really, really safe places. But the banks no longer make their money that way. So I don't want to get into that, but our banking has really changed. But all this is related, though, to moral issues, an erosion of our moral foundation, a loss of control of our passions and our desires, a loss of like really what it is to have a necessity and really what it is to have a luxury. Now we think luxuries are necessities. And so we've gotten ourselves into a terrible fix. And we have changed the way we bank. We've changed the way our system works. So we no longer work on savings. We no longer encourage thrift. We no longer encourage self-denial. We no longer encourage saving and investing. Right now, we encourage spending. And we encourage you not to save. We encourage you to spend. And we encourage you to satisfy all your desires, satiate all your desires immediately. And we want you to go out there and spend that money. We don't want any liquidity trapped in the institutions of the banks. We want that liquidity out there. In other words, we want your money out of the bank, and we want it out there flowing into services like restaurants and retail and things like that. And so, but those debt loads are piling up. And you're seeing that now, where you're seeing like house loans are having to be extended longer. People are taking 7-year loans on cars. That was unheard of. And it's not because the cars last longer. It's because of the expense of the car. And the amount of debt that people are trying to carry. And so, but this is the major economic problem. And that's what's caused our rolling in the markets. That's what's caused us. Our dollar has deflated in value. We print a ton of it. Our government is out of control. They can't cut spending. I mean, every time they talk about cutting, they're talking about cutting the rate of increase. They're going to increase spending. So instead of increasing spending 3%, they're only going to increase 2.5%. And then, one points at the other and says, that guy hates old people. He wants to cut the budget, but he doesn't want to cut the budget. He wants to reduce the rate of spending. And so that's where we are economically. And this economic instability that we have has really caused a lot of problems. And so this sort of sets the stage for political instability, because when you have political instability, you have an instability in the population. And so one of the things that we talk about all the time now, and as I close this video, is income inequality. Well, but how did income inequality get started? Well, income inequality got started because what happens is the government prints money, okay? And every time the government prints money, it reduces the value of the money that's in your pocket or your bank account. So really, it's a pernicious hidden tax. And who does that affect the most? Who does money printing affect the most? Does it affect the middle class the most? No, it affects the middle class, but not the most. Does it affect the upper classes, those who make 6 figures and more? No, it doesn't affect them the most. It affects the poor the most, because they have the least amount, then they have to stretch it the most, and they feel the inflationary costs against food, against electricity, against fuel, much more than the middle class or the upper middle and wealthier sides of our society. And so they feel that, and then they look at other people and they say, they're not struggling like I am. What's the problem? And the government says, oh, it doesn't have anything to do with us. It's the injustices. It's the injustices in the system. And it's that this majority population over here hates you and is trying to oppress you. And then the government actually points to these people. There are certain politicians that say, no, it's that guy. No, it's that guy over there. It's that guy. But it's really the government. It's really the government. And when they promise you things like free college and free health care, none of that stuff is free. It all comes at a cost. It all comes at a money printing cost. Even AOC, when somebody said, we'll have to print trillions of dollars, and she said, well, you don't mind printing trillions of dollars and giving it to corporations. By the way, she's not wrong about that. You got to admit when somebody says something correct, and she says it correctly right there. She says, hey, you don't mind printing trillions of dollars to give it to these corporations. You only complain about printing trillions of dollars when it's going to go to children. She appeals to the emotional aspect of humans, right? When do we love our children? So she appealed to that. But what you need to understand is that money that will be printed will be taken from you. And what it does is it takes that money, it takes the value of the current money that you're holding. It's a hidden tax, and it just eats out the value of it from below the surface, and you don't realize what's going on. And this is why I'll close with this here. This is why the poor are the poorest. They're the easiest manipulatable people, and they're often the ones most emotionally taxed by society's excesses. And so that's why we have a lot of politicians that feed on that. Like, I'll give you free college education, or we'll do debt forgiveness of loans. Who do you think is going to value, or who do you think is going to really benefit from college loan forgiveness? Do you think it's the poor? What percentage of the poor do you think go to college versus what percentage of the wealthy do you think go to college and complete college? You have your answer. You know that right off the bat. This is something that will not benefit the poor. As a matter of fact, it'll just cause our education system to get worse than it currently is. But without going too far afield, what we have to realize is it is our moral issues, our lack of ability to tell the truth, our lack of ability to now have a proper motivation to control our passions and our desires that have led to a complete overhaul and change in the way we think about economics and the way that economics works. And this new economic system is really set up to cause economic disparities to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And it causes a great population disparity. It causes population instability in wealth, and it causes people to point fingers at each other. And the government does participate in that by pointing fingers at others, and it causes then a political instability. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next video, how our moral instability led to an economic instability, which is now leading to a political instability. Thanks very much. Catch you next time on The American Tradition.